Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is the Fiio FH7S. This is the latest hybrid IM from Fiio, coming in at a cool $400, and well, if you recall the last time I reviewed a Fiio hybrid that wasn't a tuning collab, that was the FH7S. And if I'm honest, that IM was a bit of a disaster. At the time, I gave it 3 stars out of 5. In retrospect, I maybe should have given it just 2 because, well, part of the tuning was pretty decent on that set, but the treble was such a problem that it was kind of not really listenable. So when Fiio came to me with the FH7S, I'll be honest, I was a little bit reserved, not necessarily because of the treble thing, but I don't know. Wasn't totally sure about it, but I checked out some of their marketing material about the FH7S, and what was interesting was that they described this part of the build, the tuning, as a notch filter. Basically, they've added something in here that has been specifically designed to clean up sibilance in the recording. And frankly, that was a big problem on the FH7S, and that got my curiosity enough that I said, all right, let's do the review. They sent it in for review. I did an unboxing of this a few weeks ago, and over that past few weeks, I spent a lot of time comparing this with some other IMs in roughly the same price range, including, we'll talk about later, the Mangird T2 and the Dunu Vulkan. But yeah, I was really just kind of curious 2 things. Like, 1, how does it stand up against those other IMs in this price range? And 2, does that notch filter work? So that's what we're going to talk about in this review. Like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. If you're watching now live, how's it going? Happy Sunday afternoon. That's right, it's Sunday. And if you've got any questions about the FH7S or anything else we talk about, please do leave it in the live chat down below. At the end of the review, we'll stick around, we'll have some conversation. Hopefully I can answer all of your questions. But with that out of the way, shout out to Fiio for sending this in for review again. I do have links to them in the description down below if you want to check out the FH7S. But with that, let's just go to the table and start talking about the build quality, the physical stuff, what comes inside the box, which, as you can see, is a lot of stuff. And then we'll talk about the sound, what I like, what I don't like, and then we'll get into those nitty-gritty details and how it compares with some others. So for starters, the packaging. If you missed the unboxing, here's the packaging. Typical Fiio, very handsome packaging with this kind of holographic style on it. I like it, not that the box matters that much, but it is nice to see that at least they care. Apart from that, again, you get a ton in here. And that's not too atypical. Fiio generally is one of the most generous companies when it comes with accessories. So there's a lot in here. First of all, I mean, you get this carry case, which I'll be honest is a very nicely built carry case. You can see that it's even got little placements for your earpieces, but it's a little bit on the large side for me. I think, you know, if I only had one IM, that would not be bad for storage. It's definitely not pocketable, but not bad for storage. So that is, I will say, a nice inclusion. Apart from that, you get a ton of ear tips. You see, I've got 2 different sets of ear tips up here. These are spin fits, and these are Fiio's new ear tips. Let me actually pull these into view real quickly. I'll be honest, I did not use the Fiio's new ear tips. I mean, I did initially try them out, but the silicone quality in these is quite nice. It's got a nice gummy, kind of reminds me a lot of SpinFit's newer tips. This is SpinFit's older style. The reason I didn't stick with it though is it is pretty thin. I don't know if you can totally tell. The silicone walls are quite thin, and it can be a little bit fiddly to get a seal. And we'll talk about the fit of this in a little bit, but yeah, ultimately these tips just didn't work out that well for me with this earphone, but they are interesting tips that I kind of want to play around with more in the future. Otherwise, you know, these are pretty typical spin fit ear tips. You pull them inside out, you can kind of see the little spin fit mechanism here. I don't know how much gimmick that is versus quality, but they're actually pretty decent tips and they're not cheap. So it's nice that they include those. But of course, that's not the only tips you get. They also included this entire carrying case full of ear tips. And honestly, this case, I think this is pretty cool. I kind of want to get more of these so I can just store a lot of my tips in these. But in here you get a couple of different sets of foam tips. You get pretty typical, what do they call them? They have these labeled as bass, these labeled as vocal, these labeled as balanced ear tips, and then these are like biflange tips. What I will say, 1, I didn't really play around with these tips too much, except I did start with the standard balanced tips. I've done measurements on the balanced versus the bass versus the vocal and not really measured any noticeable difference. So I think it's nice that they include them in terms of like finding what fits for you, but if you're expecting big tuning differences from switching around between these these different tips. I would not expect that. I'll just be perfectly frank about that. That is at least my experience with those tips. But the tips are not the only inclusion in here. You do also include let's see if I can pull that up off the table. This is an MMCX connector disconnector. It's basically just a tool for making it easier to remove MMCX cables. I don't use it, but some people have issues with that stuff, so it's nice that they included that. There's also this magnetic cable tie, which I'm currently using to hold these little pieces in here. One, you got a little cleaning brush, and then here you have a swappable termination on the cable, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, but this is a 4.4 millimeter balance connector. It also comes with a 3.5 millimeter option. Interestingly, I don't think it came with the 2.5 millimeter, which is almost standard at this point. Okay, that's not that interesting. You get a little cable tie. And then they also do include tuning filters. So we did talk about these when I did the unboxing, and I have all of these measured up on squig.link, linked in the description down below if you want to see what the difference is. I will say is that the difference between all these filters is pretty minimal, but it is a real difference. They've got a bass filter, a treble filter, and a balanced. Right now I've got the balanced filter on there. I did play around with the treble filter a little bit. You can see back here, you can actually see what the difference is in the filtering, but I guess suffice to say that, I don't know, there wasn't a big difference for me between the treble filter and the balanced filter, so I just left it on the balanced. Again, there's a difference measurable. Whether or not that's hearable, it's audible, yes, but it's just not a big difference, so I just stuck with balanced. Okay, so that is all the stuff that comes inside the box, apart from the earphone and the cable itself. So let's go ahead and move our attention to this cable, which, as I was saying during the unboxing, like a lot of Fio's cables, is a very well-made cable, but I do think that it falls a little bit short in terms of the behavior. You can see here it's a little bit bouncy, which just kind of indicates that it's a little bit on the stiff side. And maybe I can actually give a bit of a demonstration of this is nitpicky, but just to kind of give you a sense of this cable is it will kind of hold a shape like that. Like it's so stiff that it almost has like a wire-like feeling. You can stretch that out and break that shape out of it pretty easily, but that's just kind of going to show, roughly how stiff this cable is. It's a little bit on the stiff side. It's nicely made. It feels really good in the hand. And I think it actually looks pretty handsome too. It's just not, I don't know, it feels maybe a little bit too heavy duty. It is kind of an effect of that stiffness. On the bright side, you do have a nice small Y-split with a functional chin slider. So this stays in place quite well, which I appreciate. And then of course you've got your preformed ear hooks up top, and you've got MMCX connectors down there, and that's kind of my technique for removing them without a tool. They are generally pretty tight MMCX connectors, which means that the cable does not rotate super loosely around the connector, which I appreciate. But yeah, I don't know. Generally, it's a decent cable. I did actually mention briefly the swappable termination. So this comes with a 3.5 millimeter, I believe, installed by default, but you can unscrew this part, pull this connector off, and then plug in the 4.4 millimeter balanced if you prefer. I would say that this termination swap mechanism is not the slickest of the bunch. There are some other more slick and easier and faster termination swap mechanisms out there, but what I do like about the Fiio stuff is that I think this is the smallest termination swap that I've seen out there. A lot of the termination swaps will just add a lot of bulk down here at the bottom of the cable, which I don't know how picky you are about it. It can be a little bit bothersome for me. So I really do actually appreciate how small and svelte this termination is. Again, not quite as slick, but if you're not swapping your terminations all the time, if you're just picking one and then setting it and forgetting it, the speed difference doesn't matter. If you're going back and forth all the time, it might matter, but for me, I just left it on 3.5 millimeter and didn't worry about it. And for the most part, didn't even realize that it was a swappable termination because it's so small. So yeah, there you go. There is the cable. So let's talk about the earpieces now. Punch in on those so you can take a look at them. Aesthetically, these things are pretty interesting. This is Fio's latest aesthetic, which is, I like to describe as kind of a little Decepticon-y looking. It's vaguely futuristic. It's vaguely robotic, almost sinister robotic. It's an all metal shell, maybe a little bit on the chonky side, as you might see here, but generally pretty well built. It's got some heft to it. It feels nice in the hand. And in terms of wearing, well, let's talk about that next. So I will say that, let's say I break my ergonomics, my fit into 3 categories, my ergonomics. We've got the ingress egress, how easy is it to put into the ear? There you go, that's pretty easy. 2, how comfortable is it? And I would say this is a very comfortable IM. It is not especially large. I would say it fits in the medium size, fairly squarely in medium size in my ear. And there's no sharp edges or anything like that. So yeah, I would say this is pretty comfortable. The nozzle is not especially long or anything like that, so pretty good. And then my 3rd category is fit security, like how well does it stay in place when I'm doing my calisthenics and being super active. I'm just kidding. I don't do calisthenics with IEMs, but I do like chew food or talk or even just, you know, kind of like sleep in my IEMs, and like how well does it stay in place. And here's what I will say that the FH7S is not super strong. It's pretty typical of other Fiio IMs, which is to say it stays in place okay. Fit security is decent, but it's not great. It fits a lot like a single dynamic driver IM, despite the fact that, you know, it has nice ingress egress and comfort is pretty good. Basically what you can see is that there's just not a lot of shape to the inside to cling into the eye or into the ear. So most of the fit stability of this is coming from how this thing connects with your ear. And that's actually why I've got SpinFit ear tips on here. And these aren't even the stock SpinFits. These are SpinFit's newer tips, which just come with a little bit better silicone. And that for me helped out with the fit security. I do think the silicone grippiness of Fio's new tips would actually be a pretty decent match. Again, that grippy silicone will help with the fit security a little bit, but I felt that I needed the extra reach from the SpinFit, so that's where I landed on in terms of tips. But yeah, that is the general gist of the build here on the Fiio. I'm going to move some stuff out of the way because Fiio included so much in this box that it's actually in the way of my hand motions, which you all appreciate. So yeah, that's the physical stuff, the build stuff. Let's now talk about the sound here on the FH7S. And like I mentioned up front, like I was really kind of curious to see, well, one, are there going to be some of the treble issues that we had in the FH5S? And if not, like, is it maybe because of that sibilance notch filter? So we'll get into that in a little bit. So general though, I'll talk about the sound signature on the FH7S. And the signature I would kind of describe as like somewhere between a very warm, bassy V-shaped sound signature and maybe a very warm, bassy neutral. So I would say it's really neither bassy nor V-shaped. Like it doesn't have a sharp contrast between the bass and the treble, but it does have very, very elevated bass and pretty well extended treble. So I don't know exactly where to call it, except for it's definitely a bassy IM. If you're looking for a bassy set, there's a ton of bass on this set, so you're not going to be disappointed there. The top end tuning on this, though, apart from just the bass, the top end tuning on this is actually pretty good. It's pretty tame in terms of like a V-shaped sound signature, right? It's not an aggressive treble performance, even though it extends quite well. I would say that the upper mid-range and the treble in general is just like almost exactly to my frequency response target. Again, if you want to check it out on squig.link, it's linked in the description down below. It's actually really well tuned up top. But again, really the tuning on this set is quite dominated by a very thick bottom end. There's a lot of bass in here, okay? Again, it's got that nice treble tuning extension, blah, 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 blah. Okay, yeah, and I did mention a little bit about the tuning filters. They did change the sounds a little bit, but they did not change it significantly. The one tuning filter I didn't listen to was the bass filter, and that was just because this thing's already got plenty of bass. There's no need to emphasize that bass even more. So that's the general sound signature on this set. Again, it's bassy. So what do I like about the sound on the FH7S? To be honest, I'm actually kind of surprised. There's quite a bit about the sound that I like a bit. The top end on this thing is actually, I would say, great. Frankly, and versus the FH5S where the top end was just a big problem. This is quite a redemption, in my opinion, for Fiio. It just gives you a nice, like that treble tuning, the upper mid-range and treble tuning in combination give you a detailed, textured sound. The treble is generally quite smooth and non-fatiguing at the same time. And it still extends really quite well, so you get a nice sense of that micro contrast and detail that carries through even into like the mid-range and stuff like that. Frankly, I would say this is the best top-end tuning I've heard from a Fiio set ever. Full stop. Like, this is awesome, awesome top-end tuning. Is the notch filter specifically doing something? Well, I can't say for sure. What I can say though is that this set, it does actually really quite well with sibilants. So I can throw some sibilant tracks at it. For example, like Church's Graffiti. That is just an album that is recorded quite sibilant, and this dealt with it better than most earphones for sure. Also got, an album by the Parcels, their live album. It's recorded a little bit hot. That's the kind of music where it can be sibilant on some sets and won't be sibilant on others, and I think the FH7S actually did a really, really good job with it. So is it because of that notch filter? I mean, I guess so. It seems like it's working, and frankly, pretty excited about that. And then the other thing that I think is also really quite likable here on the FH7S is the head stage. This thing presents quite wide. The bass that comes out of this thing kind of creates like this diffuseness to it. Like it like creates this interesting sense of depth. Plus you get the nice treble extension. It just really creates a much bigger sense of head stage than I typically expect from IMs in this price range. And again, we'll talk about how it compares to some others directly. But that was the thing about this that, in combination with the really nice top end tuning, frankly kept me coming back to this thing more often than I expected. So that's what I like about the sound here on the FH7S. There's of course going to be some things I don't like about it. So let's talk about that stuff now. And you might have noticed that I described this set up top as a very bassy set. And you might have noticed that in the section where I talked about what I liked, I didn't talk about the bass. I gotta be honest, the bass on this set is not very good. On the bright side, like it hits decently hard. Again, there's a lot of bass there. So if you're looking for a lot of bass, you'll get it there, and you do get a decent sense of physicality to it. You're not gonna be disappointed with the amount of bass, but to be honest, it's poorly defined. The attack on that bass, like that initial kind of like you're listening to like a kick drum, you get like that thump. It's just really quite soft here on the FH7S. The bass comes across, I think, a little bit smeary. And interestingly, like the bass it's got this like bloated, smeary, soft, kind of swampy sound to it. But interestingly, it doesn't really impact negatively the top end on the set, which I didn't expect that, I'll be honest. So as much as I am harping here on the bass, it was interesting that I was still able to pick out a nice sense of detail and texture from the upper mid-range. But yeah, really the bass is it's not good. It's a lot of bass and it's not great bass. I wrote down a note here that it reminds me of like nightclub bass. Not that I've even been in a nightclub, just like watching movies where there's like a nightclub scene and you just have like this sense of bass just kind of like in the background droning everywhere you go. That's kind of what the bass on this set sounds like. It's a little bit overwhelming. It's a little bit disorienting sometimes, depending on what kind of music you're listening to, and it's just a vibe that's not my usual vibe. And I would say versus the FH5S, which actually had pretty good bass, that's definitely a step back on this set. I think if you combine the top end of the FH7S with the bottom end of the FH5S, you'd have a pretty fantastic IM. But as is, you've got a really fantastic top end with a really, really subpar bottom end. So those are my thoughts here on the FH7S. But like I said, we're going to talk about how this thing compares in contrast with some specific IMs. Let me clear the table while I pull in our competitors for discussion. Okay. What I've got here on the table. This is the Dunu Vulkan. This one came out, I think, at the beginning of the summer. It's a $380 hybrid IM as well. I actually forget exactly the driver configuration, but except I do recall that it's got balanced armatures plus 2 dynamic drivers, which is pretty interesting here on the Vulkan. And then down here, we've got the Zen's Mangird T2, a bit of an awkward name, but also a hybrid IM. Wow, I've totally neglected to remember the driver configuration. It's $350. I think it's 6 BAs plus 1 dynamic driver. I think this one was 4 BAs plus 2 dynamic drivers, but I could have that one wrong. And then this one is 4 BAs and 1 dynamic driver. Goes to show you how much I care about how many drivers are in your IMs. But those are the competitors. Again, $400, $380, $350, all roughly in the same price range. Let's talk about how they vary in terms of sound signature, just the tuning. The FH7S, like I just got done describing, this is bassy, kind of a mild V-shaped sound signature. It's very thick, it's got powerful bass that dominates the sound, but it does have pretty good extension in the treble and very well-tuned upper mid-range. The Vulkan, I would describe as kind of more like a warm neutral. It does have some bass boost, but it's more of a warm neutral tune, kind of a downward sloping. The low end is more dominant than the graph, which suggests, in my opinion, here on the Vulkan, but still mostly a neutral sound signature where the treble is a little bit on the tame and rolled off side. Although there is maybe a little bit of mid-treble brightness on this set. And then finally, the Mangird T2, despite having the most awkward name of the bunch. I would actually say this is probably the most neutral of the three. It's kind of in the same vein as the Vulkan. It's kind of a warm, laid-back neutral with a bit of mild bass boost. But this is still mostly a mid-range tune. Vocals are not overly forward. The treble is quite tame and very well integrated and extends quite well here on the Mangird T2. Ranking these things in terms of sound signature, I mean, I'd probably have to say like this. The Zens is, you know, a nice, easy, neutral tune to listen to, like with a fun bit of bass, but not a ton of bass. The Vulkan is, you know, kind of similar, to be honest, but just a little bit more dark up in the treble. And then the FH7S is got by far, I would say that the top end on this set is my favorite, but unfortunately the bass is not something that you can ignore. So there is, I think, too much bass, and I would, because of that, rank that last in terms of tonality. In terms of technicalities, let's talk about this, okay? The bass, again, on the FH7S, I like the word swampy. I came up with, I thought of that this morning, and I like that's exactly the right word, is swampy. It's just woofy. There's too much of it there. It's always present. It's quite dominant, and it's not especially impactful. It's just there. It's bass. But the treble on this set is kind of excellent. It's well extended. It's airy. It's precise. It gives you also, I think, an above average head stage. Of the three here that are on the table, I would say that the treble is actually the best here on the FH7S, which is not something I expected going into this review. The Dunu Vulkan, tech-wise, I would say the bass on this is actually quite good. This is probably the best bass of the bunch. Not the most bass, that's this one, but the best bass. And if you want to hear like kind of a difference between a lot of bass and good bass, this is actually an interesting head-to-head comparison to do. You just get a nice sense of physicality. The sub-bass rumble on the Vulkan is actually quite good. I dig it. What I don't love about the Vulkan, however, is in that treble performance. It comes across like it gives like a weird clacky timbre to things. It lacks a sense of air. And I think that like imaging and stuff is the weakest here on the Vulkan. Versus the Mangird T2, I would say this is just like a nice all-arounder performer in terms of technical performance. It's very smooth in the treble presentation. It's got a decent sense of air. Bass attack, I would say, lacks a bit of definition here on the T2. I guess not too unlike that. There's just a lot less bass here, but it still lacks some of that tactility in the attack. And frankly, like I would say that this is like not that exciting of a sound. Would be maybe my one gripe I would throw against it, but generally pretty well extended in the treble, and it gives you, I'd say, an okay sense of imaging, but mostly it just gives the sense of like ease, and like this is a very comfortable set to listen to with a nice sense of detail that just won't wow you. So if I were to rank these in terms of technicalities, to be honest, this is kind of tough. I guess I'd probably say the FH7S, with that caveat of that bass, just because it gives you that sense of head stage, and then the top end is actually really, really well done. Followed up by the Mangird T2, which also has a really nice top end on it, maybe a little bit less exciting overall. And then back here in the bottom, I would say that the Vulkan, again, has the best bass of the bunch, but the rest of it is quite dull to my ear. And then in terms of form factor, I'll talk quickly about how these things compare. There is a bit of heftiness to the build of the FH7S in general. Like, it just feels like a very substantial earphone. It's got a decent look, fit security is so-so on it, and the cable's maybe a little bit stiff, but it feels quite nice for the price. $400, like, it feels like you're getting a well-built thing. The Dunu Vulkan, I think, is actually the best looking of the bunch. Let's punch it on that so you can take a look. It's got this really subtle pattern on it that I quite like. I think this is a very handsome earphone. The shells are all metal shells, like on the Fiio. And it is also an MMCX connector. The fit security on this, though, is, I would say, also just kind of so-so. It's not great fit security, but otherwise pretty comparable to the Fiio. The one thing that the Dunu is quite excellent at is this cable, which, if you've heard me talk about Dunu cables before, this is one of their best cables. It's just like the right weight, very well behaved, and it's also got the swappable terminations with Dunu's mechanism, which is a little bit slicker, if not maybe a little bit on the bulkier side. So quite like the build here on the Vulkan. And then finally, we'll talk about the T2 as I wrap this thing up. The T2 is the only IM here with plastic shells, but that also does mean they are a little bit, well, quite a bit more molded for fit, right? So the fit security here on the T2 is far and above way better than the fit security of the others. The fit here on the T2 is maybe a little bit on the medium-large side. So if you've got small ears, there's a fair warning there. This thing does fill up the concha quite a bit. But if it fits your ear quite well, or as well as it does mine, the fit security is going to be pretty fantastic. And then the cable on this set is decent. I have zero complaints about the cable on it, but there's also not a ton to talk about. It's just a decent little cable. So I think that's going to do it for my thoughts here on, unwind it, the Fiio FH7S. Is this a redemption for Fiio versus the FH5S? I think in some ways, yes. I mean, I think the FH5S had a better bottom end, but the treble just was kind of a deal killer on that set. Here on the FH7S, you've kind of got like the inverse problem, but I can much better deal with bloaty, swampy bass. And I get to appreciate a top end on it. It's surprisingly good. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I was actually surprised at myself, like how often I kept wanting to go back to and listen to this thing, given that I'm not a big bass guy and given that the bass on this set is not very good, but it does lend itself to that sense of head stage and that really quite nice treble performance that meant that I actually enjoyed this more than I expected. So I'm gonna, out of 5 stars, I'll give it 4 stars out of 5. It's close. I thought about giving it 3 out of 5, but given that I did just kind of subconsciously keep wanting to go back to this set, I'm going to give it 4 stars out of 5. And if you're interested in checking it out, I do have it linked in the description down below. Again, shout out to Fiio for sending this in for review. If you found this review helpful, you enjoyed it, please do give me a like, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review, unless you're here live, in which case hang out. Let's have a chat, hopefully answer all of your questions about swampy bass, etc.